Hey everyone, so here's the thing, 4K monitors are dropping in price big time, and in fact during last year's Black Friday event you could actually pick up a 40-inch Samsung 4K TV with full HDMI 2.0 support for less than £300. Now this is all pretty awesome except for one thing, the price of graphics hardware required to run PC games at 4K hasn't dropped in line. For the full fat 4K 60 experience, you're looking at a £700 or $700 GTX 1080 Ti. But does this completely rule out more mainstream PC hardware from providing a decent 4K experience? Well, perhaps not. After all, we've seen some pretty decent 4K or 4K games running nicely on PS4 Pro, and that's hardly the technological state-of-the-art in PC terms. So, inspired by our very own John Lineman, who bought a 4K OLED TV only to have a GTX 970 to run games on it, we proudly introduced this new series, 4K on a budget. Now the aim here is pretty straightforward. We've lashed up a mainstream rig here using a Core i5-6500 paired with a GTX 970, and we're looking to run great games on a 4K display at either 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second, depending on the game. Yes, we're going to be overclocking that 970 because, to be frank, you'd be mad not to, but we're not going to be pushing it to breaking point. Compared to reference clocks, we're adding 200 MHz to the core and 400 to 500 MHz to the GDDR5 memory. Beyond that, it's down to settings tweaks, frame rate limits and other tricks to get a decent 4K experience out of hardware that just shouldn't be capable of getting the job done. And well, we're going to be starting with a truly mighty challenge indeed. We're going to be running the entire Crysis Trilogy on this setup at native 4K resolution, and we'll start with the most difficult game of the bunch, Crysis 3, the most modern franchise entry and a game that still looks pretty awesome today. And yes, it is massively demanding. So let's get going. Okay, so here we are on our desktop here, and you can see that we've got the Core i5-6500 there, 3.2 GHz, 4 cores. Memory wise, 8 gigs of DDR4 there, 2133 MHz. And yeah, on the left there, MSI Afterburner, we're using that to identify our GPU there, definitely the GTX 970. Okay, so let's jump straight into Crysis 3 here. This is 4K resolution, very high settings, SMAA T2X anti-aliasing. This is what we use to benchmark graphics cards, and at 4K resolution it is a nightmarish workout for the GTX 970 here. So we're going to need to make some compromises, obviously. Anti-aliasing is an easy win, I think. I mean, SMAA medium T2X, you don't really need it on a 4K screen owing to the fact that pixel density is so high on 4K screens. Anti-aliasing isn't really a priority. So we're going to drop the system spec directly to high here. So we're going to go from 18 to 19 frames per second, and you can see instantly we're up to 29. So, you know, we're sort of into playable territory here, and it's looking pretty good. But obviously, this is just one scenario. We're going to need to do more. But one thing I should point out is that, well, here's the thing. A lot of people just sort of lower presets on a global level, when in actual fact, you can actually go in and change some settings and move them up to the very high, you know, equivalent to ultra settings here, and, you know, not see any hit to performance at all. So for example, geometry, whether you're at 1080p or 4K, you're still sort of generating the same level of geometry. There's no need to dial that down. But we are going to overclock. So yeah, plus 136 to the core here, plus 400 on memory. Now, plus 134, I was saying 200 MHz earlier. Now, the reason I've done this is that we're actually using the MSI version of the GTX 970, which has a 64 MHz overclock built in. So we can't actually add 200 to the core there without introducing instability. We just add plus 200 once the factory overclock is added to the mix. And yeah, you can instantly see now we've added around 10% of performance, possibly as high as 15. We're up to 35 frames per second here. 4K resolution. Now remember, this is the equivalent of 4 1080p screens being run simultaneously. And this is by a graphics card that you can pick up secondhand now for what, you know, 120, 140 pounds at the most. But you can see here that when we actually engage in combat, frame rate is dropping. And the reason about that is because, well, here's the thing. Quality presets, some of them are kind of context specific. So post-processing, for example, it's more likely to actually come into play in firefights. And yeah, we're going to need to do a bit more work here to get a more consistent frame rate. But what it does mean is that lowering these presets means that you'll have no impact to visual quality for most of the experience, you know, because it's just literally in those firefights where there are issues. So let's drop back into the menus here. We're going to put game effects up to very high. I think possibly we can get away with that, but let's give it a go. But the big ones, I guess, would be shadows. You don't really need to have shadows at high. Huge amount of GPU resources wasted there. So yeah, this is an interesting aspect of the game from the first level. This kind of distortion shader on the window here, it actually really has a huge impact on performance. And it's one of these areas where no matter what you do, there's only so much that you can actually claw back in terms of performance. So yeah, take a look at this window here. There's quite a lot going on behind that alpha effects with the rain, quite a detailed scene in the background there, lots of effects work going on, and it's causing issues, 26 frames per second. So let's dip into the settings. Let's see what we can do about that. We're going to drop shading down from high to medium. This is a bit of a compromise I didn't want to make, but I think it's going to be required. So we're sort of up to 28 frames per second there, but I really sort of think this could possibly be a memory bandwidth issue. We've already overclocked the memory, so I'm a bit concerned we can't really go too much further. Tried game effects down from very high to high, no impact whatsoever. So yeah, remember, there are a lot of settings that you can actually leave at the absolute max, even though you are running at 4K. So what more can we do here? 27 frames per second just looking through a window. It's not exactly the best way forward. Okay, let's try reducing post-processing to medium as well. Again, this is context specific. Shouldn't have too much of an impact in gameplay generally. Well, I don't know, I think maybe 1 to 2 frames per second improvement here. So we're going to need to, I guess, address this as a memory bandwidth scenario. So we're going to drop back to the desktop here and bring up MSI Afterburner. And I'll be playing it safe on the memory here with plus 400, but we can move up to plus 500. This works on pretty much all of the Maxwell cards I tried. And yeah, look, we're up to 30 frames per second. So it was a memory bandwidth issue there. Okay, good to go. Let's continue. I mean, this first level and the second, the jungle stage, are both really good workouts for seeing whether you're going to be able to maintain a locked 30 frames per second. I think that's pretty much the most viable target we've got for this game. We've got the frame rate unlocked at the moment, but you know, there's not much more wiggle room there. Okay, so I've returned to the desktop here, and this is the NVIDIA 3D settings control panel. What I'm going to do here is engage what's known as half rate adaptive VSync. And what this does is to essentially tell your monitor that you're using a 30 Hz display. It will lock the frame rate at 30 frames per second and tear only if you go beneath that frame rate. We've dropped the pre-rendered frames there down to 1. That should, in theory, help with latency. And it's kind of like going to act as a sort of restraining factor. Now, here's the thing. When you're running a game completely unlocked, you can hit any kind of bottleneck at any point. It can be CPU. More often than not, it's GPU, but you can also even hit storage as a bottleneck. What a 30 FPS cap does, first of all, it gives you a completely consistent look to the game because you're using a 60 Hz display. Each frame will be there for 2 refreshes. So you get a consistent look, and you can use motion blur to give a sort of smoother look overall. But it also gives your components more room to breathe. So, you don't really hit CPU or storage as a bottleneck. GPU is pretty much your main limiting factor here. And it's working. So, by and large, everything is looking really nice at this point. And even though we've got this kind of mixture of very high, and medium settings, it looks really, really nice. So this is my next stress test area. It's a huge level. It's the 3rd stage, actually. Very, very big level. And there's a lot going on here. Water, which can be impactful on GPU, and a lot more besides. I mean, there's a lot of combat going on here. And you will note that we are dropping beneath 30 frames per second. There's so much going on here. I mean, there's not really a huge amount you can do here. We are actually just hitting the limits of the GPU in kind of many different vectors here. There's not really so much more we can do without impacting the experience to an undue level elsewhere where we don't have these bottlenecks. So yeah, I mean, this level is absolutely fantastic. It really is a beautiful game, but it can hit your performance hard, and you have to realize that while we would like a complete lock on frame rate from start to finish, it's not always possible. Okay, so a bit further on in that third level now, and this is another example of an intense firefight here, and actually in this case the performance holds up really well. We've got lots going on here, lots of explosions, lots of post-processing, big environment, lots of water as well, which may have been a contributing factor to the performance issues earlier on, and we are locked at 30 frames per second. So yeah, for the most part you are getting a 30 frames per second experience. You can of course unlock the frame rate. I don't think it's a good idea though, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, but one thing I will say is that if you're going to be doing a 30 frames per second lock, it really is a case for using a controller rather than keyboard and mouse. Mouse controls at 30 Hertz, not very nice indeed. Okay, so we're going to move back to the original area where we were stress testing the game. This is on the jungle, and I actually played this level right the way through to completion. A few drops here and there, they're short-lived, and overall we're getting a pretty good experience here. Now, bearing in mind we are running, of course, 4K resolution here, native. It's holding up fairly well, not too bad at all overall, considering the GPU just isn't built for this kind of resolution at all. But overall, not too bad at all. So reaching the end of the jungle stage now, and again, very demanding scene this one, and we've locked things to 30 frames per second because you are mostly CPU bound here. Funnily enough, Crysis 3, you really need an i7 to run at 60 frames per second. You can overclock an i5 as much as you want, it's just not going to happen. But yeah, demanding scene, again, holding up really, really nicely. Very detailed, intricate jungle scene here, lots of post-processing, lots of screen filling explosions, a few minor dips here and there, short-lived, very playable, looks absolutely spectacular. And yeah, we're going to end our look at Crysis 3 with our established settings here, and we're going to move on to our GPU test run. So it's essentially the end of the Welcome to the Jungle stage. I'm not anticipating too many problems based on the workout we just gave it on that jungle stage, so just wait for that guy to catch up, and away we go. So yeah, this is our GPU test run. We benchmark this game here, this particular section, and yes, we do have to play it through each time, which is a massive pain in the ass, but what can you do? Okay, so just going into the tunnel here, this actually reduces GPU load in a lot of cases because we're outside of the jungle, but again, 30 frames per second lock here. You can't really say you're being shortchanged in terms of detail, in terms of the richness of the visuals. Yeah, you can move up to high and very high and get nicer effects, but you know, 4K on a GTX 970, you've got to make some compromises, but it still looks absolutely spectacular. Crysis 3 doesn't actually have a huge amount of respect in the community. All I'll say is that the first half of the campaign is really, really worth playing. The second half, I actually found it deathly dull. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up there for Crysis 3. Now, what about Crysis 2? This was actually the game where I went in having no real worries about what the GTX 970 could do. Back in the day, I played this on DX9 at least, on a 8800 GT. So yeah, not exactly the most challenging hardware. But we're going to be running on the much more demanding DX11 mode, and we're going to be running at 4K with the high texture pack. And I've left the frame rate uncapped here so you can see exactly what the 970 is capable of. And yeah, we're sort of getting anything between 35 to 50 frames per second here. Let's dip into the menus, DX11 enabled, high texture pack in, mixture of ultra and very high settings. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that back in the day, Crytek didn't have low settings for Crysis 2. They thought that low was kind of demeaning what their lowest quality preset was actually delivering. But it is high is actually low in this game, bizarrely. Moves up to very high, extreme, and then ultra. So we've got a kind of mixture of very high and ultra here. So yeah, we're kind of mixing and matching again. Again, it's kind of more the context sensitive settings like post-processing that we've had to pare back here. But 4K, 42 frames per second here, lots going on. Game is holding up very, very nicely. Big set piece here, which we always used to test back in the day for this title. You can see here, big collapse in frame rate, but we just sneak under 30 frames per second just for a second. But otherwise, again, sort of back into the 40s, 45 frames per second area here. Good stuff. So I really wanted to get some kind of similar shootout stress test, similar to the Crysis 3 one. This level looks pretty good. A lot going on here. A lot of particle work, a lot of enemies on screen, a lot of geometry, a lot of explosions. It's a pretty good workout, sort of staying around the 40, actually 35 to 40 frames per second territory here. So I think even though you can actually go much higher, I would probably be looking for a 30 frames per second lock on this game. But yeah, amazing how this game kind of still holds up pretty well. And yeah, I think we're just gonna take out a few more of these cell guards, and then there's the matter of that troublesome helicopter up there. You can shoot out the guy who's blasting you there, but if we go down here, there should be a rocket launcher. Give me a bit of a breather as well. Get some energy back. Okay, there's the rocket launcher. Get some extra rockets, and away we go. There's the helicopter. See if we can take him out. I think that hit him. I'm not entirely sure. Regardless, he's still there. So another go. Yep, there we go. Boom. Okay, so finally, let's take a look at Crysis 1. Now, this is still a hugely demanding game. When I spoke to the developers a few years back, they weren't really particularly careful about optimization at that point. They were just throwing everything and the kitchen sink at the game. So let's have a look at our settings here. We are at 4K. We have anti-aliasing turned off, just 2x MSAA, killed performance. Mixture of very high and high presets there. I actually set FXAA on in the GPU control panel here, so we would at least get some anti-aliasing. I think the thing to bear in mind is that this game still really looks quite remarkable, bearing in mind that it is so old. I mean, this game really was engineered for hardware way ahead of its time. And well, the funny thing is, of course, that the frame rates are actually lower than Crysis 2 here. But remember, Crysis 2 was kind of sea change for Crytek. They were developing for consoles at the same time there, so they really needed to put more time into optimization there. But yeah, 30 to 45 frames per second, pretty much, similar to what we were getting in Crysis 2, but obviously with far less refined visuals here. And I actually asked John which would be the most challenging level to test with Crysis, the original one, and he reckoned that the ice stage was well worth a look. So let's take a look at that. So John was saying that frame rate basically tanks on this as soon as you enter the stage, but you know, yeah, it is lower, but it is sort of holding up pretty well. Still in the 30 to 35 frames per second territory. And yeah, up to 40 here. I'm sure that's going to collapse once combat begins. But yeah, again, another example of how the environments in this game still look really, really nice. And of course, there's a whole big bunch of HD texture packs out there and various mods to make this game look much better and to further optimize it and to, you know, kind of revolutionize the look in a way. There are plenty of photorealistic mods out there for Crysis, which may be worth a look. But yeah, I think basically the GTX 970 can still offer up a very good experience on high and very high settings here. So yeah, there we go, the Crysis Trilogy. We've done it. All three games running, you know, kind of in the 30 FPS territory with creditable settings, and it will look absolutely beautiful on a 4K screen, even if you don't have the latest and the greatest GPU hardware. Anyway, please do like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. If you have any suggestions for further titles we should be testing, please do drop us a line in the comments. But for now, thanks for watching.